Okay, I was requested to do a hair groom demo, and what I've decided to do with regards to this is I will show some stuff relating to doing the groom itself, but the rendering of the hair is a factor that is difficult in order to get a decent result. So I'm going to go through that first because I think that's going to be the more interesting factor for people that already know how to do grooms. Getting a decent result where you don't have to go to something like V-Ray or RenderMan in order to get some fairly decent renders is of greater value. Now this is the Maya default render from its default shader, and this is the MIB hair illumination shader, which has no instructions on how to connect it. It's just kind of sitting there going, hey, I'm here, how's it going? So you can have your shader replaced using a tool that's available to go ahead and put any shader that you want. So you can put a Blinn on there, you can put a Lambert, MIA shader, anything that you like. And that's called the shader replacer, which can be found at this location. You'll note that if you download the P shaders from Puppet's website, they're absolutely awesome. They also have instructions on how to install them. It's got from 2012 to 2014 all installed in this one package, and even though the shader replacer is not mentioned in here, it exists, as well as a custom hair shader that he's created. And I've got some render settings here, so let's talk about that. Render settings, you want to use the unified sampling, which is default in 2014, and you want to set a quality above 1. So these both are at a quality of 1 for these renders. Your anti-aliasing should be set to something that maintains detail. So I took it away from Gaussian, I went to Mitchell. Gaussian gives you something fairly blurry, and I just used the defaults for that. So here's the unified sampling, here's the quality, it's normally set to 0.25, so I just took that and changed it to a value of 1. It goes to a value of 2 if you do require it, but I found that the returns on quality after that value of 1 seem to not be as extreme as I would like, but you may find situations where you require it. I just found that the render time just goes up significantly without really giving me a whole lot, so I kept it at a value of 1. And of course this is where I changed from Gaussian to Mitchell. I just left the values alone, but you can change those if you want. A quick comment with regards to the hair shader from Puppet. If you use Final Gathering with it, it doesn't like it. It tends to glow, at least in my initial tests, whereas most other shaders that you can add to the hair will work with Final Gathering just fine. Area light, shadows are on by default inside of Maya, at least in 2014. If you're using an earlier version, you want to turn on shadows. This ray depth limit is set. These are the defaults for it, and this is basically just about reflections and refractions. So if you had a reflective object over here, the hair would show up, but the shadow wouldn't if this was set to a value of 1. So the default value is now 3, which is great, because that means that it shows up at least in some reflections. The thing you do want to change, though, is this use light shape. Use light shape is the thing that will cast some nice shadows into the crevices and grooves in between the hairs. Regular shadows, typically speaking, with the existing hair shader, won't get into those grooves. It kind of blankets the whole overall object. The problem here is that despite the nice look of the use light shape, you have to bring the samples up quite high. Anything under a value of 128 is fairly noisy, and even 128 still produces some noise, but it's a small amount. It's about the amount that you would expect to see coming from a digital camera, so it's not a big deal. These guys are supposed to do something. This is related to the number of samples relating to the number of reflections or refractions. And this is the number of samples to use after those reflections or refractions are exhausted. At least that's what it says in the manual. That appeared to do something in some other tutorials that I found online. However, in my own experience, in this particular scene, they did absolutely squat. So this is the more important factor. This is the quality, and these guys may or may not have impact depending on elements within your scene. It could be because I don't really have a lot of reflective objects in my scene that it didn't have an impact, but so be it. So that's that. So that's your rendering and your lighting. Now let's get to this puppet shader. So the puppet shader will go into your program files, Autodesk Mental Ray for 2014. That's the one that you're installing for. There are instructions that come with it, so you can go through those. Essentially, the shader scripts, presets, plugins, and icons are the folders that you're going to need to drop stuff into from your zip that you download, which is, again, right here. And once you've installed it, you can add it to your surface. So I'm going to go to polygons. You have to create a dummy object to hold that. So I got my dummy object. Doesn't matter what it is because it's not actually going to render. As soon as you apply the shader replacer, it vanishes. So I'm going to go to Mental Ray and down to Enable Geometry Shader and click on this. And under Mental Ray, it's a geometry shader, so look for geometry. P shader replacer. Bing bong. There we go. And this object is the object that is going to receive this new rendering information. So this guy's going to vanish. He's just kind of hanging out. But as soon as you click render, he vanishes. And the object that is going to get it, I want to put that on my Paint Effects hair. So I can either copy and paste the name, or I can just type it in. So PFX, capital HAIR, 1, enter. And there we go. It's attached, and I have to bring in my shader now. So rendering, hypershade, and what it wants is a shading group. So shading groups are created for the majority of shaders that you create, and it's the shader group that you want to drop in there. So if I were to go ahead and say create materials, MIA passes, and let's just graph that, it's created a shading group for that. So let's go back to the utilities. There's my shader replacer. I'm just going to middle mouse button, drag and drop. I'm going to not drop it here. I'm going to drop it here. It's going to connect it. If I drop it in there, it just creates the name and does nothing else. So drag and drop onto there. That's connected. And now within here, I've got my material and shadow shader all set up. I can make any of the changes in here. Now my hair actually responds with things like reflections, refractions, everything. I could make glass hair. Ooh. Keep in mind that by doing this, you're taking on the render speed of that particular shader. However, this appears to be significantly faster than, say, going ahead and doing Paint Effects modify, convert Paint Effects to polygons. If you do this, you end up with an extremely slow scene, an awful lot of polygons, you don't have a lot of control over it, dynamics happen a lot slower, all sorts of bad things happen. So this is a significantly improved way of going about this. So this thing will take months to render, whereas this thing will increase it by a few minutes. So in my initial test, the basic shader took around 16 minutes to render. When I added an MIA shader, it took about 20 minutes to render. So it added about 5 minutes to my overall render time, which is not too bad. My expectation is that for a full head of hair on a detailed character with a good quality render is going to take you at least a half hour per frame. That's just the nature of things. I wouldn't expect anything faster than that. A lot of people rendering stuff off in V-Ray are having much the same kind of render times in order to get the same quality of hair. So 30-minute render times is something that you should expect. With that plugged in, I can go ahead and render that off, and I will get whatever settings I have on there attached to it. So you can make use of things like the index of refraction, 1.6 for hair, it's not 16, 1.6 for hair. And that means that you tell it to use Fresnel, and it will respond to your index of refraction. So the highlight will respond to that, and you'll get a decent result off of that. And then, of course, you pick your color of your hair. You can add translucency. Like you could even use the skin shader on it, which would have its own translucency, and the double specular controls, which are also there. So lots of options. So that's the rendering of it. I think that covers pretty much everything you need to know with regards to rendering. So for the groom, let's just hide that. What you'll note here is that I've got a number of curves here in order to get the type of groom that I have. And I've taken all their center points, or their starting points rather, and pulled them inside in order to ensure that the hair looks like it's implanted into the surface, and that's kind of an important step. So when you create these guys, if you create them from scratch as I did, you want to make sure to put those points in there. In order to do that really quickly, you can grab any set of hair curves, and you can go to your end hair and you click on the start points. And what it does is it actually clicks the ends, which is great if you want to go ahead and use soft selection and use that to move around and, I don't know, rotate, scale. Absolutely wonderful. However, I want to pull the centers in, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick walk through them. And I'm going to press the down arrow, and that down arrow has selected the initial starting one. I can press B as well to go ahead and have maybe a smoother transition to pull those guys in, and use those to pull them inside. So that was just pick walking, just using the down arrow. So you start off with selecting them, pick walk downwards, and then pull them in. How did I create these curves? That's a good question. There's a number of ways of creating the curves. If you go ahead and create any kind of surface, and I do a lot of stuff inside of Mudbox, so I scale stuff up to closer to real-world scale settings, so human head size roughly. Modify freeze transformations, I've got set to freeze scale because you never want to leave scale. If you import an object into Mudbox and the scale is still on it, it will treat it whatever size it was to begin with. So in that particular case, it would have been a 1 centimeter size object rather than the size of a head. And so if I used a grab tool or something on it, it would just freak out. It just wouldn't work properly. So always freeze your scale. I'm now going to draw some curves on it. So I could do that inside of Mudbox as well. I could go in Mudbox and draw curves in order to create those and then export those back over to Maya just using the send to Maya command. But I can also do them in here without having to jump back and forth. And that can be accomplished by going through rendering, paint effects, make that object paintable, which will allow you to draw the curves on it, which are essentially strokes, and then I can get a brush. Now I'm going to have to convert this stuff. It's not going to give me the curve by default, so I'm going to pick something that is a solid block. Some of these things, like the pencil stroke, is not good. Pencil stroke looks like it's a nice soft line, but the end result is that it creates multiple curves. I don't want multiple curves, I just want the one curve per stroke. So this is a good one, this default paint is, and you can just start to draw. And so this is how I created mine, just by going in and creating them, and you can kind of overlap some shapes and get some weave and wiggle, and just keep them sort of close together, leading from one to the other. Remember that they're all going to sort of be overlapping shapes. You can even create some smaller ones if you want. And any strokes that you don't like, you can always delete and replace. I take these guys, go modify, convert, paint effects to curves. There isn't really anything other than this hide strokes, so just convert them. I don't want to hide the strokes, I want to get rid of the strokes. So I'm just going to grab those strokes, press delete. I also want to get rid of the groups because it puts them in double groups. Shift P for parent, so I unparent them, grab the groups, and delete those. And all I'm left with is now the curves. And I can always add more at any given point in time. You can start off your groom and see how it works, and decide afterwards what you want to do with those. These curves, when you have a look at them, let's hide that. If I go into its components, you should see a square and a U at the end here. If you see those, probably not going to see it on the video, but trust me, there's a little square and a U here. That tells me that's the beginning of the curve. You'll also note with these guys, just grab them all, component mode, that the curves that it creates, there's less points on the smaller curves than there are on the larger curves, because it evenly spaces them, adding all that detail in there for you. Once I've got these curves into place, I can do all sorts of things with these. I could go back to surfaces, and if I found that they were facing the wrong direction, I could go ahead and reverse the curve direction if I find that it's creating something wrong. If I have something that I don't like the end look of and I want to be able to modify it quickly, I can always go in and rebuild curves as well. The rebuilding of the curves, the default I think here is set to 4, but this is always with cubic, it's +3, so the number of points that it will create is this number +3. So in this particular case, it'll create 10, which is the same sort of setting as the defaults for creating new curves in the in-hair system. So I'm just going to use that, rebuild, and it recreates that, and that means that I have less points that I have to deal with in order to modify the shape, so I can change that if I don't like the way that it looks. Additionally, I can make this a live surface, and then moving this stuff around means that it will move along that surface. So as I shift it around, I'm not actually leaving the shape. Make that no longer live. So all those points are on that surface. And of course, I will want to perhaps pull it away from the surface to allow that volume to build up. And of course, as I said, the centers should be inside in order to allow the hairs to flow inwards. So let's connect the hair system to these guys. Let's go to End Dynamics and Hair. I'm going to assign a hair system, new hair system to them. I'm going to go to assign Paint Effects Brush to them. And I get the Paint Effects Brush. Go to the Attributes, Hair System, Clump. So I can change the number of hairs at any given point in time, even if I've created them from scratch, and you have the ability to change that. Subsegments is the amount of detail that you will get out of it. So if you look, you see it's kind of blocky here. I'm going to add subsegments to make it rounder. I'm going to take the end here so you can see what's going on. And you see how it's everything's sort of stopping at one point. We use thinning to take care of that so that it doesn't look like that anymore. We have the ability to control the clump size so we get better overlap. So clump width. And for rendering purposes, I like to use 0.005, which is what I used in my renders here. I also like to use, under displacements, some subclipping, which will give me that same kind of tapering effect that I got off the other one, which I got rid of. But in this particular case, it takes sections and it groups them. So you get more like little strands that come through, blocked groups, which is more natural in hair. Now, you'll note that I don't have enough overlap going on here to have a suitable look to my hair. So that's where the tweaking comes in, both in the overall width of the clump, as well as you could use things like clump flatness, flatten this stuff out. But you note that everything right now is aiming in a different direction, so I would have to use the clump twist, which can be handled on a per follicle basis, and then I can go ahead and use that flatness, so it gives me a bit of thickness, but not too much. Still not a sufficient amount of actual hair to work with. Now, Shift H, you will note that the hair here is growing into that system because it's been pulled in, whereas the rest of it is sitting on top of that surface. So that's why it's important to pull those start points into that surface. So let's grab these and hair points. Again, pick walk by pressing the down arrow. I'm going to press B, just change that size. Just need the first couple and pull those down in. Maybe even pull them back a bit. And that's going to affect your orientation, so be careful. And now they look like they're growing out of that surface. And then I can continue to modify, the tips and ends and move them around. There's a lot of tedium to the process of creating this stuff, so just be aware that you're going to have to work at it. You're not going to get a groom 100% for free. These individuals, if I'm not happy with the settings for them, I'm going to their individual follicles. So that would be follicle 23. Looks like this guy. And I'm going to change him a little bit. Those are all dynamics. So I have a clump width multiplier that's there. I have a density multiplier, so maybe if I want to thin it out, I can adjust that. There's no curl on him already, so I can ignore that. If you're using a custom shader, this will not function. As the same as the color blend. Color blend is meant for blending this color into the other one. So if you turn this all the way on, that color is visible. If you turn it off, it uses the default color. But if you're using the custom shaders, then that won't work for you. Clump twist offset. So again, I can use this. If I find one of these clumps is not aligned properly, I can use that to offset it a little bit. You can add a braid to these things, but that's too small to get any effect on it. I can also use the hair scale tool, which in this particular case I guess is not going to work so well because it looks like it drags it away from the surface. So in that particular case I may have to use just points to make it longer. Ouch. And that's not the start curve. Let's go here, display start position. See if the hair scale will work on that one. Nope. So there we go. So I can pull that out. That will actually change the size of this. If you create them on the actual surface, which we'll do after this, you can go ahead and adjust the parameter U and V to change the position on the surface via the follicle rather than pulling the points. But that's just a preference thing. So I'm going to use the overrides so that I can also change clump width, which doesn't appear to be working. So I have to use this guy now, but this doesn't appear to have, or sorry, that's the wrong one. The clump width scale doesn't appear to have any impact on it, so I'm just going to turn that off and use it as is, and then this I guess works. Change its individual width, so if I wanted it smaller, I could do so. You notice that I get some drop out of the actual curves. So you can play with the density there in order to accommodate that. So those are the kind of things that you'd be doing in order to adjust your groom as you go. Look for bald spots. You can always take a bald spot and refill it at any given time by Shift H. Let's go back to rendering, paint effects, get that brush, just use the same one, and say, okay, well I'm finding that I have some bald spots here, so I want to eliminate bald spots. I'll go ahead and do that. This guy here, maybe another one through there. And then take these new strokes, modify, convert. Get rid of those. Go down to the bottom of that, Shift P. I went down to the bottom by pressing the down arrow, so I got to the children of them, because it would be difficult to select them amongst all of this in the viewport. So just grab the top row and then down arrow a couple of times and then unparent them just to clear them out of there. And then I'm going to take these guys and go to and dynamic skin and hair and say assign hair system and assign the existing hair system. It'll jump them into there, it'll automatically add the hair to them, and then you do the modifications that you need to do to them. So again, I'm just going to grab that, pick walk down, whoops. For some reason, it was still connected to this. Let's pull that down and in. And there we go, less of a bald spot. I could probably still put some more in there. And that's essentially how I did mine. Additionally, when you're working with this stuff here, each one of these curves, if you find at some point you really don't like the end result that you're getting from that particular curve, you can still rebuild it let's just show start position. Actually, that's the start position. Surfaces, edit curves, rebuild curve, and you notice that the actual hair updates along with it. So if you find something that you've made is a bit too jagged or you need to modify it, you don't need to delete it and then recreate it. You can just go ahead and grab that start curve and then rebuild it, and it will automatically keep it connected to everything else. And that will give you your groom. So what other methods can I use? Well, let's create a new scene. Like I said, you can go into Mudbox, do a sculpt like a hair shape, and use that sculpt to either draw in here or to draw on curves inside of Mudbox, which you can export across. You could use ZBrush. ZBrush has a fiber mesh where you can export the curves and send them off to Maya, and that will allow you to export an MA that will have curves which you can apply the hair system to, just the same as we did there. You also have the possibility of making sure that when you export it, to set it to a level of 0 for its export. You'd think that would export no curves, but it actually exports the minimum number of curves. So when you export those, use a lower value. Otherwise, you end up with so many curves, it's just insane. I don't have ZBrush, so I can't show you that on here. I have additionally a method where you can go ahead, which is really old actually. There's a really old tutorial hanging out somewhere where you create any kind of NURBS surface and go to isoparm and pick anywhere along there, and you can duplicate those surface curves. So duplicate surface curve will create that. You get those. NURBS are better than polygons because polygons create individual curves per edge. So if you were to create that out of polygons, same idea. Just turn off soft selection. Edit curves, duplicate surface curves. You get that, but it creates multiple curves. You notice this one's green. It's multiple curves that I've got here. So 9 have been created. I can go in here and I can attach curves, and even if I have the keep originals off, it still keeps the originals, which is bizarre. So that new curve, you have to delete the history of. And there's all those other ones that are still there. So even though I told it not to keep them, they're still there. So there's a lot of hassle and cleanup when you do it with polygons, so it's better to use NURBS for those cases. Now with that, I'm going to show you this image here. There is a script, GMH convert polygons to curves or something like that. He uses for hair, and a number of people have done grooms this way where they've modeled out of polygons. You can do the same thing out of curves, and then you can just extract the curves yourself. I don't know how much the script is, and I think the last time I looked at it, it wasn't available for the current version of Maya. There wasn't an update for it. I could be wrong, but I didn't see one. So this is essentially a process. I mean, a lot of people that create polygon hair will create it this way, and this allows you to take polygon hair and then convert it to real hair. So if you've got a polygon groom that you've done before, you could potentially convert that. Now, converting polygons to NURBS is, well, it's essentially doing this. If I were to want to do that, rather than doing every single curve like that, I'd probably end up doing just the edges. So I'm just holding down Shift, those, duplicate surface curves, delete the history off those guys, edit curves, attach curves, attach curves, delete the history off that. Delete those guys. Delete those guys. And I end up with this. So any kind of polygon surface that I've created, if I've already created it and I wanted to keep it because it was a tedious long time to do, I could probably do one strip at a time and then go through the surfaces loft to recreate that shape. So that's the easiest way that I know of to recreate a NURBS surface out of polygons, just by extracting the curves and rebuilding it with a loft. There is, under Modify, Convert, a NURBS to polygons, but there's no polygons to NURBS. There's polygon edges to curve, which is what we just played with. And again, ooh, there you go. See, I thought they worked exactly the same way and I never tested it. I love learning new stuff. So that gives you those surfaces, and that's going to be way easier to go ahead and create anything. And we've got that. Under Modify, Convert, you also have, where is it, polygons to subdivs, and you can go from subdivs to NURBS. However, this usually creates numerous patches. So you end up with one surface initially that ends up creating multiple surfaces at the end, so not as great. But this looks like it's way better. I don't know why it isn't the default response with the other one, but that will allow you to create numerous surfaces. I wonder if I can do multiple surfaces at the same time. Let's try that. So I'll go here, and I'll do this one, and this one. Modify, Convert, polygon edges to curve, and it only did the one. So there's the disadvantage. You can only do one curve at a time. So be it. That's the end result. So you can create those curves, and then you can loft them, and then recreate the shape and extract a whole bunch of curves out of them. So the duplicate surface curve from a NURBS surface in this particular case. So I'll grab this one and this one. Surfaces loft. It's just going to create kind of a straight shape, so if I need more, I would have done another row there. But isoparm, duplicate surface curve, isoparm, and press G to repeat the command. And again, isoparm and G, repeat the command. So it's much faster to be able to recreate that than necessarily going the other route. So that's a way of going about doing that. So you go ahead and model that stuff and get that in there. So the final thing that I'm going to say is under N here and dynamics, create N here. When you create it this way, there's a U and V count. It uses your UVs. So whatever the count is here, counts 8 across, 8 down, or 10 or 12, or whatever you want to create, and it will fill in that area using, if there's a polygon sitting over top of where it creates one, a UV section, then it will create that on that polygon there. If there isn't one, then it will create nothing. For example, if I were to do this, I would get no hair, nothing. Even if I went ahead and used this, which is to select the individual faces and apply it, if they do not sit in the UV range, it will not create them. That is because follicles, when you create them, have a U and V value that's associated to them. So keep that in mind. Also, when you lay out your UVs, the UVs determine the orientation of the follicle. So the initial orientation of the follicle is based on the UV coordinates. So if your face is facing up and down, then your UV tells the follicle to face in that direction, and if you were to rotate that in here, it would rotate the follicle. So the direction of the flow of your geometry in your UVs also determines the direction of flow and thus the rotation of the follicle in this world, even when you're using the selected points and faces. The only reason why that becomes invalid is when you actually manually create curves, which you then assign hair to. So that's what it comes down to. So just keep that in mind. UVs are an important factor to these. Another factor here is that, again, even if you're using the selected points and faces and you have very small UVs, you will get next to no actual hair created. And the reason for this is because UV space, while it should be infinite, it's not, at least not in terms of how this creates things. So what you end up with is, even though you selected all the faces here, you would probably end up with only maybe 3 follicles on the whole object, because there's not enough UV space for it to calculate the numbers for every single individual face. So make sure you make good use of your UV coordinate space for any shells that you're using to extrude hair from. Your points per hair when it creates it, and the length is in my units. And just keep in mind that this determines how accurate the collisions are, because it usually uses points initially to do the corrections. If you have a point here and a point here, that hair is going to go through the surface because it's only collided here and here. So the number of points determines the accuracy of your collision and how it molds to that surface. Also, the number of points you would require in order to wrap around a surface needs to be considerable in order to be able to get multiple points going around and around and around and around to wrap around things if you want to do that. The number of points also leads to the amount of time that it takes to calculate simulations, but it's still pretty fast. Nucleus is fairly decent, especially on modern machines, so it's not a super big deal. So that's basically it. You need to be in object mode. And that will create those. When I return, they will automatically go back to this. So if I go ahead and let them play out and do their dynamics thing and whatnot, and grab these follicles, go to N hair, set start position from current. When I return, that will be the starting point. So if you need to work from hair directly extruded from the surface, rather than the painting of curves or modeling of shapes, you can use this to just grow out of that surface and start working with them. And that gives you kind of a good starting point. So they're already pulling in the direction of gravity. In addition to that, you can use other tools. Fields could use a different gravity. Go to the attributes. Don't want it to go into the negative y because that's the direction gravity is already traveling. Let's try that. So in the z direction. And I will tell it to use a volume. Let's get a sphere. Go ahead and scale it up. And I'm just going to increase the magnitude. Right now it doesn't appear to be connected. So I'm just going to, can't remember which one I have to connect it to. So just going to affect the selected objects, which should cause that. And what happens here, I can go to nHair and tell it to dynamically play, which means I can move the stuff around. And I can use this to groom hair. So I can take it and pull it in. And I can also use that distance value. Let's just stop that momentarily. And this distance value will give me a fall off, so use max distance. And now the distance is set to 1. Let's use dynamic play. I have to get in pretty close for it to work. So I can use that to help pull it. But I need to have enough of a distance. So that'll allow you to have sort of a tapering, so you can pull them and have less of an overall impact. And you can use those to throw things around. And then use that to create your start point for those. Cases where I've used this are with newtons. And what is a newton? It's a delicious cookie. No. It is Field's Newton is a point where everything goes to. Let's make sure it's selected. And so you can use multiple newtons to pull stuff in. So if you wanted to do like a ponytail, you can use that to pull that stuff together, and it will create a center point. That's not going to work because I need to see my start point. So hair, start position from current, and then display start positions. So I can use that to then scale stuff. You can also delete points on curves to eliminate elements that you don't like. So once you've got it in there, you can go ahead and eliminate that. Or you can always go in and physically pull that stuff around. So once you've got it in here, you can then start working with those control vertices, and that's the start point, that is. Oh, have to be at the beginning, otherwise I don't see the stuff move. And you can use that to also adjust this so that it's a little bit more tidy. And then you can go ahead and model, whatever you want to attach it to. So you can use dynamics to help you groom hair as well to a certain degree. It's not necessarily the most ideal method, but it's yet another method in the long list. So the point is that doing a hair groom is a long and usually fairly tedious process. It's a creative process. You have to go through the process in order to get a good look. There isn't a free make awesome hair kind of tool. There are some sculpting tools that are available through other softwares, which you can try and take advantage of and then export those curves to Maya and use those. But otherwise, that's really all there is to creating a groom. So if you want to do it, you got to spend the time. So hopefully that covers everything that you need to know with regards to the hair systems, at least for grooming and rendering. There's a number of other elements here, like creating constraints, which you can use to constrain points of the hair to specific areas. So if you want them to continue to use dynamics but parts of it to be held in place, you can use transform constraints, which you can then do things like parent to the head or attach to other elements in order to get that sort of response, so you can animate them. But that's more of a dynamics thing. Hair textures, there's some built-in hair texture related stuff which you can use to control certain aspects. If you're using the traditional Paint Effects shader to start off with, what you will notice is, if I go into shading, there it is, and I plug in a texture here, it will use the UVs that the object was grown out of in order to calculate the actual hair shading. So if you wanted like a strip of gray hair in one patch, then you could go ahead and make a texture that would all be that initial texture or initial color, and then that one area where that hair grows out, you would make a gray color, and that would give you a strip of gray hair. So you can control that if you want. If you do want to use this initial hair shader, the Maya's hair shader as well, good idea is to probably eliminate this guy. I found that it often created some dark regions right at the ends here, which were visible underneath. Opacity, if you're using this hair shader, don't touch it. Use the hair width in order to do that. 0.005 is a decent number. If you take opacity, it will appear thinner and softer, but it will also, typically speaking, increase your render time almost exponentially. So I tend not to play with it. Your speculative power is how broad or narrow it is. So the higher the number, the more narrow your specular. Lower the number, the more broad and more blurry, I guess, the specular highlight is. Making use of noise, if you're using real world scale, you want to increase that beyond its default value. So value of 5 will give you bigger shapes for the noise rather than being smaller shapes. Same thing for the curl. Values can always go above them, so if you're using a larger scale of hair, you want to increase that. Really, there's just tons of stuff to talk about with regards to hair, potentially. I mean, there's lots of stuff hanging out in these menus. So it's midnight for me. I've attempted to record this video multiple times, so I think I'm just going to leave it at this. Hopefully you find the information useful, and I think I'm going to go to bed.